All right, guys. So let's get into Unit 5, Topic 3. We're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution. We've just finished up talking about revolutions in general, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitians, and etc. We're still going to see the spirit of revolution take place, and we're going to still see some of these ideas from the Enlightenment influence how we are seeing changes economically. So we're going to change from this agricultural economy to this industrial machine operated economy. So we're going to see lots of changes in those aspects. Okay, so let's get started with that. So our learning objective for this section, we're going to talk about how environmental factors contribute to industrialization from 1750 to 1900. So again, we're getting into much more modern history. So the theme and the focus here is going to be interactions with the environment. So if you're in my AP class, you know about the spice T chart. So this would be the I, interactions with the environment. So we're going to talk about the factors that contribute to the growth of the Industrial Revolution and the industrial production system, which results from proximity to waterways, geographic distribution of coal, urbanization, legal protections, access to resources, and the accumulation of capital. We're also going to talk about the development of the factory system in general, concentrating production in a single location, leading to an increased degree in specialization of labor. So we're going to talk about all of those major changes that take place during this period. Now, the focus here is typically going to be on Britain. We're going to talk about Great Britain. And the reason being is because this is really where the Industrial Revolution gets its start. Okay. So the Industrial Revolution is this process I should back up here. The industrialization in general is the process by which an economy transforms from an agrarian economy, an agricultural economy, to one that's based on the manufacturing of goods. We see a shift from manual labor. You see the images here from a cottage industry, manual labor, people creating things in their home on a small scale, to large scale factory production on a machine driven process. Okay, that's industrialization. Now we've seen something similar. You can compare this to things that we saw when we saw the growth of industries in Song China. Now that wasn't on this particular scale. That wasn't machine driven. It was still manual labor, but they did that on a larger scale because of the growth of their population. So some similar sort of ideas here, where production was taken out of the home, things were created and made for commercialization, right? Commercial purpose. But here, that process, instead of being driven by manual labor, is being driven by mechanized labor. Okay, so again, the center of the topic here in Unit 5, not only are we talking about revolutions at the beginning and the Enlightenment, but we're also going to start talking about industrialization, and that's going to be a big chunk of this section. So make sure that you are fully aware and understand how that influences society, right? How we see a change and a shift in society from changing from this cottage industry to these factory productions, from the growth of cities. How does that change things? Okay. And this list here is going to set us up pretty well for the remainder of the unit. So again, the reason why we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, particularly in Britain, is because this is where it gets its start in the late 18th century, the late 1700s. Again, a transition from handmade goods to machine-produced items. We see the use of textiles, iron, and coal mining as being the first to see significant changes. You see the development of railways and canals that improved the transportation of goods. The rapid growth of cities as people move from rural areas to seeking factory jobs in cities. Capitalism grows, financial institutions grow, so this changes how society operates, changes the different parts of the society that we'll talk about, changes our economics, setting the stage for global industrialization, global trade, global imperialism, and changing the middle, working, and upper classes as well. So we'll start to see a lot of these changes, but again, this is going to be sort of an overview, particularly on how the environment plays a role into that. Now, during the early days, before the Industrial Revolution really takes off, in the early days of industrialization, Britain's network of rivers and canals really boosts its industrial growth. These waterways kind of make it possible to efficiently transport raw materials, make it possible to transport finished products back to ports and cities. Okay, and the canals as well. You see there Britain creating artificial canals to link inland areas to trade routes. Okay, those canals link unconnected regions. They bridge the gap with the natural river network and ensures that even inland regions have access to trade routes. This creates a cost-effective transportation system that reduces the cost of goods, so makes goods cheaper, and brings about interconnected markets, encourages specialization and a larger scale production. So you could have, say, for example, a factory that made shoes in one city that supplies shoes to an entire region. So the next city over doesn't also need to have a shoe factory when there's one down the canal or down the river. So Britain's waterways become kind of the artery of the Industrial Revolution, and it promotes domestic trade, promotes international commerce, right? So it really becomes the lifeblood of the Industrial Revolution, and this is sort of the driving force behind it. And again, think of the waterways in much like you would think of a highway today, right? That's how those waterways were used to transport goods, transport either the raw materials to the factory or transport the finished goods from the factory out to the port. And those were the uses that you had for those waterways. The next environmental thing that becomes very important for Britain as far as the Industrial Revolution is its geographical makeup. It has an abundant access to very essential raw materials, and that starts to make it kind of the epicenter, the middle, the starting point of the Industrial Revolution, right? The Industrial Revolution really gets its start here in Great Britain. And so you have coal that's found in really large quantities in places like South Wales, Northumberland, and the Midlands. That the coal is used to power the steam engines. It's used to heat furnaces. It's used to drive the machinery. Right? We don't really have electricity at this point. Okay, so coal is really used to power those factories. You also have iron, which is plentiful in places like the forests of Dean and the Weald, and it's crucial for construction, right? It's used in building machinery, it's used in building tools, it's used in constructing railways, constructing buildings. So iron becomes sort of that crucial part for infrastructure expansion. And then you also have timber as well, which is kind of harvested lumber, harvested from domestic forests, and could also be imported because of the vast maritime reach of Britain. If you think back to Unit 4, when we talked about the British Empire, you can remember how widespread its reach was. And that's indispensable for shipbuilding, which is really a driving force between the growth of the British Navy and its dominance as a force and its trade prowess, and becomes a fuel source as well. We used wood to power factories before we really made use of and took advantage of mining coal. Now, industrialization also changes how the country looks. And then again, in particular here, we're talking about Great Britain and the promise of employment opportunities and new and growing industries drives a lot of people to move to towns and cities and create urban centers. These urban centers kind of grow up around these different factories and mills, and they grow at a huge rate, at a very rapid rate to accommodate the number of workers who are moving there. And that urbanization created a very readily available workforce, again, that's concentrated in a dense urban environment. Okay, so it makes it much easier for factories and industries to source out labor efficiently and cheaply. So these dense urban environments also foster innovation. So you have knowledge that's circulating around very quickly. It's much easier to talk to people who have ideas. So you bring together labor, you bring together capital, you bring together the entrepreneurial spirit within a smaller area, a concentrated area. And that helps to accelerate the pace of industrial growth, which kind of creates a very symbiotic relationship where industrialization is actually going to cause more urbanization. And more urbanization then fuels more industrialization and vice versa. So there's this juxtaposition where we have one thing leading to the other, which then causes more of the first, right? So more industrialization leads to more urbanization, and more urbanization leads to more industrialization. Okay, so keep that in mind. Next, we're going to talk about two very kind of key instrumental innovations that significantly enhance the agricultural productivity during these early stages of the Industrial Revolution here in Britain. So one of those is crop rotation. By alternating the crops that are grown on the same plot of land, farmers could then enrich the soil, kind of break up, right, improve the soil health, and break up the cycles of pests and diseases that happen with specific crops. So that practice made sure that the soil retained its nutrients and prevented it from being exhausted from continuously planting the same crop. And as a result, we see more yield, more crops grown, and more land becoming viable and available for farming. So before, right, the same crop grown on the same plot of land over and over and over again. Now we rotate that, and that's a practice that still takes place today. We do not grow the same crops on the same plot of land every year, right? We rotate those consistently. The other um, innovation was the seed drill. Planting before the seed drill happened with the seeds being sort of scattered and thrown by hand. Things weren't really spaced out really well. They were grown at a very inconsistent depth, and it was a very inefficient use of seeds. But the seed drill made sure that the seeds themselves were planted at a consistent depth. They were spaced out consistently. That resulted in more of the seeds kind of sprouting and growing, and really maximized the use of land, and again caused for an increase in production of agricultural products. So the result of those innovations, the result of that improved productivity, leads to higher agricultural yields, right? So again, improved agricultural practice results in more food produced, and with more food available, there's more population, right? And fewer people face food scarcity, fewer people are dying because of famine, etc., right? A growing population. Now, with that growing population, but a more efficient agricultural industry, there's actually fewer people needed to work on a farm. So that excess labor, that increased labor that we don't need to use on farms, starts to migrate from the rural areas to urban centers, right? Which we just talked about, urbanization. So that increases the urban population, the growing agricultural output allows Britain to support the urban population, which allows Britain to sustain that workforce that's needed to grow the industrial sector during the Industrial Revolution. So if it were not for these improved agricultural practices, would we have seen as significant growth in the Industrial Revolution as we did? Probably not, right? And it would have probably been much later on in history. But these practices led to lots of innovation, and led to a growing population, and led to shifts in population from the country, from rural to urban centers, and that fueled that industrialization. Now, the next thing that we'll talk about here is sort of the lead up to the Industrial Revolution. In that period, as we get towards the Industrial Revolution, Britain undergoes significant legal and cultural shifts that change and recognize and protect private property rights. And if we remember back to Section 1 and Section 2 of Unit 5, we talked about the Enlightenment period. And one of the ideas from the Enlightenment period is that people should have some form of ownership over the product of which they work, right? And you can go back to your notes and review that. And one of the other ones is the belief in the pursuit of property and the pursuit of property ownership and privacy. Those things were sort of new ideas during the Enlightenment period, and that starts to find its way into the legal system. So Britain puts in place sort of what's called the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement during the 18th century involved kind of consolidating small landownings into larger farms that are owned by individual landowners. So there's this kind of framework where you define what is private property, and that is protected by the law, by legal statute. And then that safeguard ensures that someone can invest and in something, can someone who runs that business, runs that farm, could retain all of the benefits from their innovations and their investments without being expropriated. And that certainty of the protection of assets, not only just with farming, right? The enclosure movement did start particularly with farms, but then this framework sort of is used in other areas, not just in farming, right? Recognition and protection of private property, but assets then become homes, become private property, factories, etc., right? Become private property. So this idea of private property, this idea of private property rights and protection, legal protection for private property rights, uh, makes people feel like they can invest in new technology, they can invest in new businesses, they can invest in new manufacturing processes because they know that their profit, their intellectual property is legally protected and is legally safe. This is why we have things like copyright laws now and intellectual property rights and things like that that exist today kind of get their start from here. And so this kind of acts as a catalyst for the Industrial Revolution as a whole. It creates this environment where you can have innovation, you can have risk taking, you can have capital investment, you can have accumulation that's really, really important for industrial growth. And it's one of the more significant developments in the late 18th century as we get into the Industrial Revolution that takes place in Britain. And it's an idea, this legal protection idea, that goes to other regions that do experience industrialization as well. So something we'll touch on again as we go. Now, Britain also is this huge colonial empire as well, so it has a unique advantage during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. Its empire stretches out across continents. We've talked about the British Empire a little bit, but the size of the British Empire gives it unparalleled access to lots of foreign resources, raw materials like cotton from India, rubber from Malaysia, or Malaya as it was known then various minerals and precious metals from Africa, timber, metals, whatnot. All of this comes into Britain, supplying the factories with the materials that they need to produce things. And then those colonies, those British colonies, right? We sort of touched on this when we talked about the American Revolution, and we talked about mercantilism. Those colonies then are very captivated markets for British manufactured goods. So you have this not only a constant supply of raw material, but you have a ready-made market for your finished products. So this is a relationship between Britain and its colonies that really kind of not only grows the economy in Britain, but plays a really big fundamental role in financing and the fueling of the Industrial Revolution. It's a continuous cycle of extracting resources and goods from your uh, from your colonies and then exporting them back as finished goods that creates this economic engine that really puts Britain at this position where it's at the forefront of global industrialization. So essentially, Britain could get whatever materials that it needed or wanted from almost anywhere in the world. You see an image there, right? The establishment of the East India Company claiming raw materials from India, right? So far flung across the world, or still having some colonies in America, in the Americas, or still having colonies and things in Africa. So they could get anything pretty much from anywhere. And that's what put Britain on a position where it became sort of the epicenter and the really the Kickstarter to this industrial revolution. Now, lastly, we're going to talk about the accumulation of capital. Now, prior to and then during the Industrial Revolution, Britain was able to kind of accumulate and amass a huge amount of wealth and capital facilitated through different channels, through trade with Asia, Africa, trade in the Americas, and it reflected the country's increasing financial sophistication, its global economic dominance. Britain's colonies allowed it to accumulate that vast amounts of wealth. And again, think back to the idea of mercantilism and the favorable balance of trade from Unit 4, right? Taking out of the raw resources from your colony and then selling your finished goods back to them. So we also see the establishment of financial institutions, which provide a safe way for businesses to grow. So you have modern banks that are allowing businesses to save money, move money around. You have stock exchanges, which provide a way for companies to raise capital for further investment, much like we saw with the joint stock companies, right? Those then transition into stock markets and stock exchanges. So that allows for investment in infrastructure and investment in business expansion. We see creation of new insurance companies that facilitate trade and investment by kind of limiting the risk that's associated with industrial projects and trade. So some of the things that we've talked about when we talked about joint stock companies, those kind of mature and become much more modern and become really huge factors in the growth of the Industrial Revolution, as we continue to see here and we'll continue to see in throughout this unit. So here are the key ideas that you need to kind of keep in mind from the Industrial Revolution. These are all things that contributed to the onset of the Industrial Revolution in Britain from the late 18th century. And again, we're talking about mostly environmental factors in interaction with the environment. So proximity to waterways, how did those contribute to the Industrial Revolution? How did Britain's geography contribute to the Industrial Revolution as well? The production of and the use of coal, iron, and timber. How did that lead to urbanization? How did that change the shift from farming communities to cities? How did we improve agricultural productivity? What did that mean for the soil? What did that mean for growth in those agricultural communities and agricultural production? What sort of legal protections did we see for private property? Private property is then an idea that's taken into the Americas. So make sure you have a good understanding of that enclosure movement and then the access to foreign resources and the accumulation of capital. Those are all important ideas to keep in mind out of this unit or out of this section, excuse me.